kind of watched this film at the wrong time, and yet I still thoroughly enjoyed it. So the day before I watched The Ballad of Josie, I actually watched the second time around, which is a slightly similar film with Debbie Reynolds. I think the other film was, released about 6 or 7 years previously. The Ballad of Josie I watched because Doris Day is in it, and I just selected a Doris Day film at random. I didn't realise the plot would be quite similar. So to start off with, I worried that it would hinder my experience because I thoroughly enjoyed the other film. But the fact that I really enjoyed The Ballad of Josie means that it was really a good film. Because if it hadn't been a great film, then I probably wouldn't have taken to it as much due to the previous film. So this, as I said, was released in 1967, and the main reason, and really the only reason that I watched it, was because of Doris Day. And directed by Andrew V. McLaglen, and based on the screenplay by Harold Swanton. And the description from IMDb is as follows. A widow stirs things up in a western town by raising sheep instead of cattle and organising the local women to demonstrate for women's suffrage. That's not actually a really accurate description, to be perfectly honest. I feel like it's missing some things. But it's not completely off the mark. Josie... I find it hard to describe what happens at the very beginning without spoiling it, because it's pretty shocking, but in the first 5 minutes she becomes a widow. I won't say how. And then she has to learn to make it on her own, and she has her young son, but her young son has to go away and live with his grandfather, because obviously that's a more stable, financially stable household for him at the time, and Josie has to try and get back on her feet and prove that she can make it in a man's world, because the West, in terms of ranches and running things, very much is a man's world. And that is very, very similar to the plot of Second Time Around. And I will say Second Time Around is better. But, they're not really comparable as such. They weren't released that closely. It's not fair for me to compare them. It's just the fact that I saw them 2 days in a row that I feel like there are certain things this film could have done a bit more of. It could have pushed her femininity in a man's world a bit more. But there is one great scene, and I won't spoil anything, I won't go into any great detail, but there is a scene where, in fact, in the poster she's wearing trousers, so I can tell you that there's a scene where she goes to get trousers, and it is so funny. That, for me, is my favourite scene in it all. She's just so blasé about it, but the man who's running the shop is very confused and shocked, and it's great fun. That's probably the funniest moment. This film is listed as a comedy western, and I'll be honest, I didn't think it was that funny. There are moments. I'd say altogether there was maybe 15 minutes of comedy, and the film is just over 100 minutes. So for me, it wasn't a funny film. It was a very enjoyable film. It was a very often emotional film, an important film in terms of women's rights, but it wasn't that funny. I did think, actually there's one moment where, I won't tell you what happens, but Doris Day, Josie goes, I think she says something like, "Fetch me my trousers." And that, just her facial expression at that point is the best thing in the world. Doris Day's performance is lovely. I don't know how accurate the portrayal of the West is. I'm not sure when this is set. I believe it would have just been the turn of the century. But for me, it felt believable. It felt realistic. If you are particularly knowledgeable about the West, then maybe you can point out some things that could have been done differently. But for me, it was very effective and very enjoyable to watch. The comedic scenes weren't over the top. Sometimes you'll get kind of almost like slapstick in a Western. But that's not what was going on here at all. So I thought that was very, very well done. I have no complaints about this. I did think that the romance element, it's not a romantic film. There's not strong romance. The romance that was in it, I felt was irrelevant. But I think that's maybe just because I didn't like the character development there. But for the most part, the film was an absolute delight. Thoroughly recommend it. I would still recommend second time around over this one, but I love Doris Day. I think she is pretty impeccable. And the Ballad of Josie, although not her greatest, is good fun.